Hello everyone, today we talk about the medieval County of Holland, a state of the Holy Roman Empire ruled from 1433 by the Valois Burgundy and from 1482 by the Habsburgs, that had in fact a long history throughout the modern age, going on as a province of the Dutch Republic until the Batavian Revolution of 1795. But today we stop to the Middle Ages only. We already made a video about medieval Frisia, the so-called Magna Frisia, that in part actually encompassed the modern region of Holland in the west, right, as we will see now, from essentially west of the Vlierstrom, and we will see how the name of Holland also came about, territorially, politically. And we observed, so part of the early medieval Netherlands. We didn't talk about Friesland as properly, in fact, the land east of the Vlierstrom, so we will make another video about that for the rest of the Middle Ages. But in part, you can use that video as in part as a premise, because of course Holland was also kind of the more developed part of Frisia. We have seen how it was incorporated in the Carolingian Empire since the 8th century, in spite of the local revolts. We're talking about very important areas, if anything, because here is the Rhine mouth, and so as we will see, especially during the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, the counts of Holland would rise to this great preeminence because they could control the traffics between the North Sea and the Rhine Valley, and for the rest, these were not particularly developed areas. They had been inhabited historically in antiquity by the Caninefates and the Frisians. In fact, there is a discontinuity also between what we call the Frisi and the Frisians during the migration era. We haven't talked about that, but in part we addressed these things when talking about the Anglo-Saxon migration, for example, as these were areas that were actually encompassed, and from which many, in fact, Germanic peoples migrated from to Britain, and not only, right? This was a Frankish influenced, if not generally speaking, dominated area for a long time, and the most developed part was the southern part. In fact, where the Rhine mouth is, and where also in the southwest the Zeeland is, that the counts of Holland will in fact struggle for the control of against the bishops of Utrecht mostly, and then there is the Swedes, what was called the Swedersee, and east of that, in fact, what you call as Frisia. Right, so we are looking today at the development of the feudal state of Holland, right? The County of Holland and her dependencies. There were various houses, as we will see now, and so looking at the oldest sources about the land and the powers that began to emerge from here, we see essentially the county still of Frisia. This is it was the name. West of the Vlierstrom is the seaway between the Dutch islands of Vlieland to its southwest and the Terschelling in the northeast. And thus this was, as we were saying before, essentially the West Frisia. And before 1101, sources speak openly of Frisian counts, because naturally these areas were, as we will see now, already incorporated in the Carolingian system, its vassalatic beneficiary evolution, and they had been framed under that imperial hierarchy, right? And in 1101, what happens is that Floris II, the first from the native dynasty of Holland to be called Count of Holland, in fact, acquires this title, reigning from 1091 until his death. Right, so there was already a continuity again. This house. Sometimes we don't know exactly the various chains. We don't understand whether rulers are just, one the son of the other, right? But in chronological order. But fundamentally, we're talking about the same district, the same area, and albeit with some degree also of instability, also mobility, vacancy, also of the various seas of control, because there wasn't really like a major center, like a city or something. So what was really important here was, from one side, protecting the land. At that point, the Viking era had been quite challenging for the land, but also controlling, in fact, also the local trade flow, which triggered, in fact, wars between the Holy Roman Empire and the Counts of Holland. And if you look at it in a quite forward future perspective, you see that the Netherlands, the United Provinces, will be the only state that seceded from the Holy Roman Empire historically, right? Having been part of it, and there is this old enmity, in fact, that hadn't anything specifically national in that sense, also because it was essentially a feudal struggle, but of course it was concretely based on the local policy since, in fact, the time of the Merovingians, even or even before with the Romans, right? This main power that from which the local local communities tend to escape, right, centrifugally, because they're more peripheral, even frontier areas with another world in the north and also in the east in the early times, that the main power struggled always to bring back under control. Holland, as we will see now, as a name, probably derives from the Old Dutch Holtland, literally meaning woodland. This was essentially a swampy area, as we will see, would emerge from, as the center of the communal castellation policy, fundamentally, to control the international trade flow passing through it. So we have the first Floris II, known as in the sources Florentius Comes de Holland, right? So Floris, Count of Holland. And this title was maintained until 1291, when Floris V, Count of Holland, decided to call himself Count of Holland and Zeeland, Lord of Friesland. And in fact, this title would be used also later when the House of Holland was united with the one of Hainaut, also the Wittelsbachs, the Bavaria-Straubing branch, and eventually the Valois Burgundy, the Burgundian state, right? It's not properly the Duchy of Burgundy. The titles eventually, however, lost importance because these lands were gradually absorbed by, in fact, the successors of the Burgundians. And if you think about Philip II of Spain, he mentioned them halfway throughout his long list of titles, just as, again, one of the main. And this land, of course, is also the one that would rise historically, as opposed to Flanders, fundamentally, as the new rampant political and kind of economic center of the Netherlands, broadly meant, and much of the origins, which in fact which stem exactly from medieval times, albeit it was a very gradual rise, and just from the 80 Years' War, you have fundamentally a truly independent policy that even there struggled for quite a while for its existence, right? So, as we know, we've made really many videos about the Carolingian Empire, and again, that video about Magna Frisia should tell you a bit everything about the area. Under the Carolingians, the Netherlands were organized in the typical, administrative fashion, with essentially local districts, the Gau in the Germanic Frankish language, or Pagus in Latin. So a count could rule on one or more Gaue Pagi. Naturally, at the time, the potential of the Netherlands was quite modest, and people say, well, it was a general depression altogether in Europe. Well, not quite, and especially in Carolingian times. As you know, the northern traffics, especially the one properly with the North Sea, intensified. So the political and strategic relevance of this land increased, especially because it was, as we were saying before, a frontier one, from which also the Vikings were starting to infiltrate. The Frisians also were brought down by the Carolingians, and people say part of the reason why the Scandinavians began also to push forward is that they kind of took the place of the former Frisian pirates in the North Sea. Well, these are kind of all causes or con causes. I don't know, call them like that, but the problem is larger, and in my opinion, it doesn't derive in from any kind of particular demographic or climatic issue. It's just that the Carolingian Empire was collapsing, and so like it happens all the time, all the other lesser powers around began to essentially to exploit the situation, to devour the carcass in part, and the land, of course, was subject to what was in the eye of the storm. In this regard, the local populace had always been quite difficult to tame. Historically, they didn't like the Franks. They didn't like the enforced Christianization. So there is a bit of hybrid, even after the Franks objectively subdue for good these peoples, some kind of sympathy towards the broader northern pagan world, and some possibility of infiltration of the same north through that way. But generally speaking, we are looking at a land that is also, in fact, for good framed within the imperial world, and so even those Vikings that will settle will actually, broadly speaking, take part, just like the Normans properly on the lower sand, etc., in the broader local policy, because that's where fundamentally they wanted to get. And on the long run, there is just the state will part of the Holy Roman Empire, of the probably in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom. During the partitions of the Carolingian Empire, Frisia was framed within the so-called Middle Francia, that was ruled by the emperor, in fact, Lothar I. And as you know, the part north of the Alps was fundamentally just a much more unstable system that wasn't to evolve, in fact, into a major kingdom or anything that could stand on its feet. And for this reason, the same Emperor Lothar had rewarded the Danish brothers Rorik and Harald with the further northern land, so the present-day Holland too, in this attempt to resist to the same other Viking attacks. Right, this was the habitual policy that, by some standard, would work. This is what the Romans had done, and what the Carolingians had done, and only because these empires were crumbling from within, eventually, this thing went out of hand by a certain degree. This infiltration was untenable on the long run, if not, by becoming essentially a Frankish reality itself. When Lothar died in 855, the northern part of Middle Francia was awarded to his second son. Lothar II was called Lotharingia. And the 880 Treaty of Ribemont added the kingdom of Lotharingia, which included the Low Countries, to East Francia, right, which from there on attempted essentially always to integrate it. This is a very important step because fundamentally this northern part, like the Low Countries in general, were not inhabited by a single people, right? They were not like, for example, the Eastern Frankish stem duchies like Franconia, Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia were, historically some, defined countries within themselves. So the reason why the Eastern Frankish kingdom could eventually come to incorporate, as you know, historically, the Lotharingia, is that the Western Frankish kingdom underwent that it was more powerful altogether, but underwent exactly for this reason on a local level to a much earlier disintegration, right, in terms of public power, because the local noblemen were just very rich. They could do whatever they could on their own without sticking together fundamentally, and they also cooperated with the Vikings at times, and this in part saved also the same monarchy in the process. Whereas Eastern Francia, albeit, was historically more concerned with the eastern and southern borders, because they cared especially about the Magyars that were the main threat to Germany, and they always, at a certain point, at least attempted to reincorporate the Italic kingdom. And in fact, their early capital was in Regensburg, so on the Danube, and from the opposite side of Lotharingia. The problem, in fact, of this region being subdued, given again that this region also owned the Rhine mouth, it's also one of the most important political, strategic, commercial assets of the time. Think about the core of the Frankish arms and armor production was exported throughout the Rhine. Also, the same Scandinavians essentially bought their arms from there. So the broader attempt, as we will see for centuries, by the Holy Roman Empire, was to regain control of this area, and specifically of the area of Holland, that, as we've seen, was in fact albeit small, exactly the one that had that control and thus that power. And so, as we will see now, most of the same coalescence of the County of Holland derives from this broader role in competition, even with the Holy Roman Imperial domination locally. The fact that Lotharingia had considerable self-determination became clear when, especially Louis the Child, that was the Eastern Frankish last Carolingian, died in 911. So, as you know, until the rise of Henry the Fowler and the Renovatio Imperii of his son Otto I and the end of the Magyar raids, etc., this was a big time of trouble in Germany. And the monarchy had considerable difficulties in, controlling, at that point, anything but their own stem duchy. Right? Lotharingia made a very important field choice, because while the Eastern Frankish stem duchies essentially flocked to the Duke Conrad I after the extension of the Carolingian dynasty, in fact, the Lotharingians chose as their king the Carolingian Western Frankish monarch Charles the Simple, right? Who also had, as we were saying before, a pretty troubled time in his own land. He was also defeated, captured, deposed, etc. But the Frisians decided to, the Lotharingians say better at this point, but we have the focus still on the Netherlands, to back him, as, first of all, he was just objectively the closer sovereign, because even though they were at that point fundamentally in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and this is a bit the ambiguity of the Low Countries during the Middle Ages, there was a part that was imperial and a part that was French. The County of Flanders, we never made a video about that, but it was French. Historic was a French past, and that kind of made sense, because first of all, Vikings were doing their job all around, and the situation was very precarious. So if you really need to stick to a center, even in this case of a frontier area, and this is the paradox of the fragmentation of the Western Frankish kingdom, and albeit it was weak, or exactly because he was weak, the periphery would still be willing to recognize the king, because they didn't perceive him as a threat, and they were willing to give him more power, even though he had a very modest one. And in this sense, the Netherlands in general felt, in a sense, closer, in fact, to Western Frankish rather than Eastern Frankish affairs, even though, of course, they were also historically, like if there is some general separation between the Romance and the Germanic world, and of course the lands of Holland were Germanic historically, they still had this greater proximity, political proximity to Western Francia, or at least they were opposed and enemies, as we will see, of the Eastern Frankish kings that were instead always trying to regain some control as soon as they could on that land specifically. In fact, the situation in Frisia was complex. Power was in the hands of the aforementioned Viking leaders, right? Rorik's successor, Godfrid, became embroiled in the same politics of the Frankish Empire, and he was allied specifically with the children of Lothar II. However, Danish rule ended in 885, so even before the end of the Carolingian Empire, 3 years later, as Godfrid was assassinated at Harrisbeek, and all the Danes east of the coastal areas of West Frisia were massacred or expelled in one of the most impressive political strategic feats of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, that in this sense proved to be really advanced compared in general to Norse piracy and this kind of infiltration, and coping with it in this regard, because behind this, the plot, the murder of Godfrid, and thus the beheading of the local Danish leadership, were Henry of Franconia, who was essentially the leading military commander of the last years of the Carolingian Empire, right? So a powerful figure. The Babenberg Franks, the Hamaland Saxons, and the Teisterband Frisians themselves. And all these powers were in cooperation with the Bishop of Cologne, who was the closest spiritual figure, and also, an important, in fact, lord himself in what would become, in fact, the most important city of Germany, quite strongly connected. It already was, telling the truth, quite connected with the North Sea Rhine trade, and quite involved commercially, politically, maintaining this route open. And the emperor himself. And this proves also, generally speaking, what was the feeling of the local Frisians towards the same Danes, right? They could, in a sense, sympathize with them as long as they could seek for autonomization, but they were surely not looking for new masters, per se. The chief conspirator in the murder of Godfrid was Everard Saxon, was the Count of Hamaland, that is essentially this historical region in the continental part of today's Netherlands, also part of northwestern Germany. And one of those who profited most from the power vacuum, and this was the Frisian Gerolf, the second count of this name, who is attested in the area of Friesland, and the main area of power seems to have been in the Kennemerland, that was also a place where historically the Frisians had been fighting against the Carolingians, etc. They're talking about, as you know, also extensionally, they're not big areas. Like, they're pretty much the same places historically in the Netherlands that had that specific, were theaters of specific political military events. And Gerolf came to rule essentially also in Westergoa, that is one of the 7 sea lands and one of the 3 that now lie within the borders of today's Dutch province of Friesland. Gerulf was thus a significant Frisian lord, and had been a former envoy to the emperor of the same Godfred, right? So he had been, of course, part of the Danish establishment, right? Given that, of course, the Vikings had fundamentally associated themselves with the local rulers in order to have any grip there, demanded now, quite aware of his own role in the area, to the same emperor, lands in the Moselle Valley. And this demand actually equated to a declaration of war, because this, first of all, meant to extend further the power of the Frisians at the expense, again, of basically the major waterways of the empire, and especially the core of the Eastern Frankish northern traffics, as we've seen. And after the elimination of a large part of the Danish population, that was also probably swept away by this ruler, because they were a problem, right? And they were an alien threat. At the end of the day, Gerulf controlled a large Frisian part of what would become later the County of Holland, right? So mostly this western part that we defined before. At that point, there was not much that the emperor could do to dislodge the same Gerulf, to launch a war against the Frisians. I mean, considering all the issues that, the empire was falling apart. These were peripheral areas, and no matter how important they were, especially for the Eastern Franks, it was difficult to reach them in the first place, to carry out a war, right, for something that didn't, also for most of some other continental nobility, didn't seem to be quite appealing. It wasn't so much to loot, to deport, etc. And this was, again, the continuation of the older Frisian enmity towards the empire, in a sense. And for this reason, in 889, August the 4th specifically, Gerulf was recognized the allodium of the governed lands by the Eastern Frankish monarch Arnulf of Carinthia. And that also, as you understand from here, Carinthia and Holland are diametrically opposed lands in the boundaries of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. So this tells you also how, in a sense, Germany was historically put together at that point from quite, with peoples that basically had nothing to do with each other, if not a broader, ethno-linguistic commonality. And the reason why the Arnulf, by the way, accepted to recognize Gerulf's allodium in Frisia is that he understood that even though this lord could create problems even against the empire, it was very more important in the moment of greatest Viking threat for the empire to secure the delta region, the lowlands, from the Danish and other Viking raids, by in fact reinforcing the local warlords. And this is also why the area of Frisia in general witnesses some important encapsulation during the following the same century, but especially the 10th, a bit more differently from the rest of the empire, in the causes specifically, as most encapsulation in Europe basically had nothing to do with any external foreign invasion, where just local lords were essentially aggrandizing their own power and controlling the surrounding countryside and carving out their states on their own. This is what the Frisians were doing themselves, as you understand with Geralt. But at the same time, this was a true frontier area, pretty hit by the Vikings. So there was also a much more strictly strategical aim to keep some invaders out, right? And the land was very good for it, because even though it's quite exposed to the sea, the hinterland is a nightmare, and this is what the Franks also had learned the hard way, and they would keep, and the same Counts of Holland actually would derive great difficulties from even in controlling the land, because the Frisians were always going to rebel in a certain sense, and ambushing and trapping in the swamps in this area was starting to be claimed from the sea in the way it changed a little the face of the modern as the modern country that we know from the mid-12th century. This was very savage wildlands, and were extremely complicated to control. Doesn't matter how extensionally reduced they were really a trap. The lands recognized in allodium by Arnulf of Carinthia to Gerulf of Frisia were included an area outside the same county that would become the one of Holland, as we will see now again how the name would rise from historical, but it was already, at least nominally, the county was already the center of this power, loosely, but still. And outside of that, in the Teisterband, which included Thiel, Aalborg, and Asch, and it also involved a forest and a field between the mouth of the Old Rhine, the Oude Rijn, the branch of the Rhine dealt in the Dutch provinces of Utrecht and South Holland, starting west of Utrecht at Harmelen, and today runs by a mechanical pumping station in the North Sea at Katwijk, right? But before, of course, it was different, and presumably, also we're talking about the village of Bennebroek in Bloemendaal, North Holland today, Sweeter de Sage, and so the border between the former Frankish counties of Rhineland and Kennemerland. So an impressive set of lands that were exactly, again, essentially securing control both on the Frankish frontier and the Rhine mouth. Also, the King of West Francia, Charles the Simple, gave the church in Egmont and its possessions to the Count Dirk I of Holland in 922. This is the earliest monastery in possession of the Counts of Holland, and this gift stemmed as a reward for Dirk's support in the Battle of Soissons, fought on June the 15th, 923, by, in fact, the Charles the Simple, Carolingian forces backed, in fact, by the Lotharingians and the Normans as well, that had already been settled in the lower Seine Valley, and the insurgent nobles led by Robert I, right? The Count of Paris. So we're talking about the ancestors eventually of the Capetians. And in that battle, Charles actually was captured. I mean, Robert I was killed, but still he won the battle. And on that occasion, Dirk of Holland had stood, however, loyally with the king. And the reason why Charles the Simple eventually got away with this concessions, with this enfeoffment to the Dutch, is that those areas were too decentralized to represent kind of a loss in case of enfeoffment, right? They couldn't control them anyway, so this was the game we were talking about before. The king was formally recognized further, right, as an international figure by those who had an interest to receive their own gifts, and this would strengthen the position of both contractors in that case. And plus, there is in this exchange, of course, the competition between the West and in the East Franks, because Lotharingia was part of the Eastern Frankish dominion, as we've seen, but still the Western Frankish king could say, well, no, that's, I will deal, right, if I'm powerful enough with that land, in spite of that, right, I will still, if somebody there recognizes me as sovereign, I will surely not decline that offer. So this explains very well what the Dutch were doing against the Eastern Franks in general. And the Egmont was just north of possessions which Dirk had received from the Saint Gerulf. Through this donation, Dirk could afford Dirk stand for Theodoric, by the way. The compaction of a more kind of rationally concentrated amount of territories, which for the time was a big deal, important perhaps. In a land like Frisia, it was relatively easier, a bit just like in Eastern Francia in general, because feudalism would take quite a while to start, let's say, according to the Western Frankish pattern. But still, we're talking about considerable assets. And in this sense, realize that before this, the local powers had been much more modest, right? So that's why properly the rise of the County of Holland is crucial here, because it's literally an autonomous entity that also starts to get important international connections by and work in the sense to remain autonomous, right? So that kind of spirit of independence that you find in Dutch history, and there it's already something that is forming itself again for this multitude of issues, and mostly being a frontier land, but also being pressured by other powers all around historically. What I was saying before is that Egmont had an abbey founded by the same Dirk. Before, I don't know what I said, as if the abbey already existed, was given by, no, it was founded there, and this constitutes, it was a Benedictine monastery, like all the monasteries at the time were Benedictine in Western Europe, and this is, in fact, the oldest monastery in the Holland region, historically. That tells you also how primitive still these lands really were. And in the meanwhile, Charles the Simple was deposed in 923. In the meanwhile, Henry the Fowler of East Francia allied with the Count Gilbert of Hainaut, who was the son of the Duke Regnier of Lorraine, by the way. And in the process, the Eastern Frankish monarch reconquered Lotharingia. You know that Henry the Fowler is the founder of the Ottonian dynasty, at least, retrospectively, because the name is taken after his son. But he is the one that refuses also properly the imperial title, but manages to set the basis for the Ottonian Renovatio Imperii, reconnecting a great part of the Eastern Frankish lands and securing especially a great power during castellation in Saxony, their ancestral lands. And obviously, Henry's move was aimed at regaining control on the Rhine mouth. By 925, the Lotharingian nobility had accepted his rule, so that also the Frisian lands became formally at that point a fifth German stem duchy. It was a fiction because again there was nothing like cohesively ethnic or politically or historically in this land. It was cut just out of the the Carolingian repartitions. But it was very important to assert this this entity, this district, actually this duchy, in as part, as the integrating part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and thus ruled also internationally by the Eastern Frankish ruler. Naturally, Henry's power was still importantly decentralized. He ruled essentially through his vassal Gilbert, that was the proper Duke of Lotharingia, while Henry was the king of the realm in the first place. But the same Gilbert's power was limited to his own countess, and thus there was no direct control on all the land, and Frisia remained still autonomous, but feeling cornered by this move. So the House of Holland was rising. In general, this was proved, for example, in 938 when Count Dirk II, that was, we think, at least the grandson of Count Dirk I, married at the age of 8 with Hildegard of Flanders. She was the daughter of Count Arnulf I, known as the Great, the first Count of Flanders, that, as we've seen, gravitated more essentially in the western part of the former Francia. Thus, this marriage showed both, let's say, the rising international prestige of the County of Holland, but also, again, this kind of attempt to escape the Eastern pressure. At this point, by the way, the situation was pretty strained for Central Europe in general. The same Counts of Holland were essentially military commanders who had to resist Viking raids, and as we've seen, at least this was a common political and strategic aim with the Eastern Frankish monarchs. They had, and in theory, the Count of Holland in the feudal hierarchy was subject to the authority of the Bishop of Utrecht, who was just next door, and would act as essentially as an imperial poem. Yes, we're talking about the 10th century now. The empire would be reprisinated, and so this is also as we will see now, the main enemy of the Counts of Holland in the area. In 885, King Otto III, Otto was not emperor yet in this case, and at the request of his mother Theophano, granted the ownership, literally the proprium in the document, of a number of lands to Count Dirk II of Holland. Right. So still there was an imperial need to secure a stronghold in Frisia for internal and external balance. These lands had already been given in beneficium, literally, to the Count of Holland, right? So there was here a further feudal expansion, which, of course, the Dutch, the Counts of Holland specifically, could receive this new land in fief, but also connecting themselves more to the emperor. At that point was still, however, the universal power, in spite of the limits of also the quite consistently so of the Germanic Empire from a territorial point of view. But still, it was a prestigious bond, right? Even for someone who was seeking for autonomy, and still essentially consolidating their own lordly power on a local level through such beneficium. we're talking, in fact, about an impressive amount of land that was thus augmenting over time. The one between the rivers Loire, written in the Latin document, which is the Lier, right? And the Lier is a village in the Dutch province of South Holland, still today. The Hisla, that is a gau called Maasland. The Maasland is also a town in western Netherlands today. The Villa Sunnimeri, that would be on the Zealandish island of Schouwen and today known as Zonnemeyer. The area between the rivers Medemblik and Kinnelozara Gemerki, that is Kinneheim, and Digo Texel in North Holland. This process, however, triggered, as we were saying before, a local response also by the commoners, the local people who, given the lower social certification of these lands, were more powerful in relative terms, in fact, to the nobility that struggled instead more than in other areas of Europe to centralize, because there was kind of less surplus in spite of the improving economy, generally speaking. And so this process was of feudal consolidation was opposed strongly by the populace, who historically, as we all see, and especially in what would remain as Frisia proper, as opposed to Holland in the west, would always put up an important resistance, would kind of mark even the military history of Europe. The Frisians were some of the protagonists of the infantry-only victories in the first half of the 14th century. Again, nothing clamorous by scale, but still worth mentioning. There's also similar populations like the German Dithmarschen against the Counts of Holstein, etc. They were, similar. They're comparable, right? Some very hard, kind of primitive, warlike populations, essentially severed from continental Europe by swamps, by this, there were a labyrinth, again, that especially heavy cavalry had to be very wary of, that would essentially preserve their own autonomy, and that these feudal lords trying to take it away from them, and resisting in arms and with incredible brutality and but quite clear vision about what their liberty was worth. In fact, in 993, Count Arnulf of Ghent was killed in a battle against the Frisian land reclaimers, who did not want to pay their due to the Count. Interestingly enough, Arnulf of Ghent had succeeded his father as Count of Frisia, right, as well. So there is naturally the vicissitudes of the houses, in fact, of Holland are very complicated. We cannot just summarize them in this video. Perhaps we will talk about these things hopefully in the future. It's just we're talking about the same kind of mechanism, the feudal lords emerging from the County of Holland as rulers trying to increase their grip on the local population. We don't even know where this battle was fought, but it was probably in the Rhineland or in the Maas estuary. Arnulf's son, Count Dirk III of Holland, was a minor at the time. His mother was Luthgardis of Luxembourg, who acted thus as a regent for her son. In 1005, Dirk, however, was old enough to rule in his own name, yet he still required an important support from his mother's side, and according to Thietmar of Merseburg, a reconciliation with the Frisians was arranged with the help of Dirk's uncle-in-law, King Henry II, who had married a Luxembourg, in fact, Luthgarde's sister. And in fact, the same emperor, the last of the Ottonian dynasty, the Bavarian branch, as you know, traveled with an army in a fleet. This is what also the older the Carolingians had done, because again, you needed to move also, and you had an advantage there logistically to move also on water from Utrecht to the Maas estuary, probably at Vlartingen, sitting in South Holland, and to force the inhabitants to recognize their Count Dirk. And the expedition was successful because after this expedition, no revolts against the Count in the southern part of what would become the later County of Holland are known, right? Of course, there would have still been some kind of, revolt in the form of sort of brigandage, or, dissent, etc. But at this point, the would-be Counts of Holland secure a firmer position, also with this important imperial backing. After all, was essentially at this point managing to use the Dutch vassals to, generally speaking, stabilize the province, and thus, generally speaking, achieving a broader result for the Eastern Frankish king. And in all these upheavals with the Frisians that had been rebelling, the Count struggling to keep them down, Dirk III had made a vow that he solved by going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When he came back from the Holy Land, however, he realized that the northern part of the County of Holland had been destabilized, so he moved south and started granting their rights to reclaim lands from nature around the present-day area of the aforementioned Vlartingen in order to cultivate these lands. And generally speaking, the south was kind of the better option in general, aside from, at least from an economical point of view, because the lands were more connected commercially, etc. And there could be a profitable scenery to be established there as a center of the County of Holland. Here, Dirk built a castle in a place known at the time as Silva Merivido, the future Vlartingen, as a matter of fact. And from this castle, what Dirk did was effectively forcing merchants that traveled per ship from Thiel to England to pay toll. This naturally meant that part of those resources were being sucked away from the gains that were, from the same tolls that were exacted instead upstream, up the river in Central Europe, in Germany. This is the reason why the Bishop of Utrecht, as we've seen, was faithful imperial vassal, Adalbold, and also the merchants of Thiel complained against this policy that was practically piracy, right? We're talking about the beginning of the 11th century. There are not many differences, especially in such lands. There was a Reichstag convened at summit at Nijmegen in 1018, denouncing to the emperor the tax revenue loss that the merchants of Thiel specifically were experiencing because of the plundering of Dirk III. And this prompted an imperial reaction. In fact, an army led by Godfrey II, Duke of Lower Lorraine, consisting of a fleet with soldiers from the bishops of Utrecht, but also Cologne, Cambrai, Liège, right? So even powers that were, not directly, let's say, involved in the Rhine traffic, at least directly, but that were definitely concerned by the rise in power of the Dutch, participated. However, this major expedition was surprisingly ambushed in a swamp and nearly annihilated by Dirk III Frisian subjects in what was known as the Battle of Vlartingen, as a matter of fact. And this is fascinating because, again, it's always the same political strategic plot. The power that arrives and, hoping to tame this rebellion, but always risking to be ambushed and to be bogged down. It's interesting to stress here that in spite of the rivalry that existed between the Count and the local people in general, the latter here were aware that a foreign victory would have brought to a sensible decline of their condition anyway. So what really happened here is that Dirk III was coordinating his subjects that had taken up arms, however, already by themselves, and the Count appeared from his castle to officially take prisoner the Duke of Lower Lorraine when Godfrey, in fact, the second, was on the verge of being killed. So this was also a useful maneuver to show that it was not really the Count that had rebelled to the Emperor that was responsible for this, but that in general he was actually even intervening on behalf of the feudal nobiliar life to be spared, to be saved. Actually, this was a major victory that made overlapping both the Count and the people's interest. So, as not to weaken the protection, the County of Holland offered against the Viking raids. King Henry II decided to, that we're continuing, by the way, because we are still in a moment in which especially Denmark is quite active and there is a lot of pressure still put on the sea frontier. The King Henry II decided to let the matter rest. This force had been significantly crippled, but it was not a directly imperial force per se. It was just this local, say, neighboring vassals that had tried essentially to teach a lesson to the Dutch. However, Henry still was aware of what this defeat meant, and thus he strengthened the position of the Bishop of Utrecht. It was still the most important vassal in the area, and probably the one that was more at risk of being weakened by the Count. And that was, let's stress it, nominally a vassal of the same bishop. Right? In spite of this, Dirk managed to go on with his territorial expansion, especially to the east, because the Bishop of Utrecht had lots of possessions, in fact, in the east, around the Zuiderzee, but also in the south, right, Utrecht. And this land, in fact, was stripped from the bishop. When Henry II died in 1024, Dirk III supported the candidature of Conrad II, the Salian. I made a video about his life and times, just to tell more or less what Germany was at the time. And this was a clever move because, given that the Eastern Frankish crown was elective, there was a chance to back, of course, a candidate that would have negotiated there some preconditions, and definitely not an enmity towards what would be Holland at this point. And in fact, Conrad was also elected, so this was another success of Dirk, which allowed him to maintain the lands previously acquired and even expanding his conquest further. Emperor Conrad died during a stay in the same Utrecht in 1039, during the rule of Bishop Bernulf, after which the sovereign organs were interred, in fact, in the Cathedral of Utrecht, St. Martin. His son and successor, Henry III, granted numerous favors to the bishopric of Utrecht, strengthening it further. And in this way, the Oversteeg, which is practically yet another eastern region, including most of the modern-day province of Drenthe, right, was assigned to the bishopric in 1040. This effectively doubled the bishopric possession, and the Count of Holland was, yes, reconciled with the emperor, but there was still a broader awareness by especially at this point by Henry III, and previously also by the same Conrad the second. Was not that they loved each other. I mean, it was a very subtle political game, as you understand, but were determined to recover an important control over Frisia, over the local county, and thus, achieving this important goal of controlling to an ecclesiastical principality the mouth of the Rhine, which largely already happened with Cologne. And here we are in a phase in which the local church supports the monarchy in Germany. Later on in the 13th century, everything would collapse, but at this point there was quite strongly this dynamic favoring, after all, the construction of a national monarchy, and the local nobility, like the Counts of Holland, were countering it in an anti-centralizing fashion. In fact, in 1046, Henry III managed to force Dirk IV to relinquish the lands he had conquered. The only problem is that the emperor didn't have a real foothold in the area, right? Not even properly through the Bishop of Utrecht. So the same imperial forces could not remain and were forced to retreat. As a response, Dirk IV started to raid and plunder the bishoprics of Utrecht and Liège. Moreover, he signed a treaty with Godfrey the Bearded, Duke of Lower Lorraine, as well as with the Counts of Flanders and Hainaut. And this is interesting because it shows, compared to some time before, as we've seen, that after all, the interference of imperial interference in the region was not very appreciated by vassals who were greatly augmenting their power, their autonomy. Probably the expansion of the bishopric of Utrecht was perceived as quite of a threat by the lay nobility. The emperor responded with a second punitive expedition that managed to take away from Dirk IV both Vlartingen and the castle of Rijnsburg, the latter being razed to the ground. However, Henry III suffered heavy losses during his retreat, which again were due to the fact that a major army could not really maintain itself locally and amidst a hostile population on a terrible ground and pretty much far away from the main centers of imperial power. And at that point, also Dirk's allies, in fact, revolted openly against the emperor. So a very important turn. In 1049, Dirk was, however, lured into a trap and killed by assassins hired by the bishops of Metz, Liège, and Utrecht, that said, in fact, represent more the ecclesiastical party, and one of the main enemies, as we've seen, Utrecht, but also Liège had been pillaged by Dirk. So it was an escalation, a significant one. Dirk was still young at the time of his death, and he was both unmarried and childless, thus he was succeeded by his brother Floris the First. Floris managed to expand his territory with a small area within the Rhineland Gau, an area called Altland, that means woodland or whole land, and that's what effectively would become the core land of the county, and thus giving the name to the entire domination, also on Frisia, on Zeeland, etc. And so we speak of Holland and the County of Holland mostly because of this specific power base started with Floris the First, and probably it's from those times that the name of Holland was became synonymous with the entire domination of the Count. In 1061, another war broke out. We don't know even exactly with whom, probably either against Brabant, Utrecht, or Liège. And during this war, Floris was ambushed while he was pillaging in the former Teisterband county, that was Utrecht's at that by then, after the main imperial expedition and Utrechtine reinforcement in the area, and he was killed, in fact, either by Utrechtine or Gueldrin troops. This tells you also the broader temper of the times. I mean, it was still essentially a militarized area and quite a hot one for the local resources possibilities. Floris' son, Dirk V, was a minor, so the government passed to his mother, Gertrude of Saxony, who acted as a regent. And Gertrude remarried in 1063 with Robert the Frisian, that was a younger brother of the Count of Flanders, Baldwin VI, who was also Count of Hainaut, by the way, and a grandson of a former French king, Robert II, who also acted as a regent for Dirk V. Robert II was the second ruler from the Capetian dynasty, by the way, so you understand there how much in the lowlands there was this still ambiguity regarding the allegiance to this or that kingdom, right? For the sake of their own interest, naturally. In 1064, Emperor Henry IV, the Salian, donated lands belonging to the County of Holland, quote, west of the Vlistrom and around the banks of the Rhine. This is literally the Gau of West Flinge, to William the First, Bishop of Utrecht. That was the typical representative of the German imperial system, which as we've seen, bishops were the main officials of the empire. And William was very trusted by the emperor. So effectively, you realize that the rulers of Germany still saw essentially the rise of the Counts of Holland as a threat of some sort. And Dirk V was at that point allowed by the empire to keep just the Gau of Mazaland, so a restricted area. So there was warfare, unsurprisingly, battles fought in 1071, 1072. William of Utrecht, with support of the very powerful and capable Godfrey IV of Lower Lorraine, known as the Hunchback, managed to gain actual direct control over nearly the entire territory that would make up the later County of Holland, for the first time, by the way. And on this occasion, Robert the Frisian and Dirk V had to flee to Ghent in Flanders. So this is interesting because it tells you how powerful, after all, also the surrounding, especially the Bishop of Utrecht, but in this sense, something that was imperially backed and at this point still quite with important expensive capacities, could extromit literally the Counts of Holland that again didn't have much of a large territory in the first place. And this event, in fact, could have put an end to the so-called Gerulfingen dynasty in Holland. However, Robert the Frisian managed, quite with some important luck as well, to become the Count of Flanders in 1076, as he had been able to defeat 5 years before at the Battle of Cassel the Grand Coalition of Hainaut, some Western Frankish and also Normandian forces, and on the base of this Flemish power, he could essentially assist Dirk V, his stepson, in the reclamation of the County of Holland. The County of Flanders was becoming really, as you know, one of the main powers in the area. Had already factually become the same. Norman conquest of England had been possible thanks to the Flemish support. So we're talking about also, as we know, this will be the protagonists also in the First Crusade, very strong feudal Western Frankish military culture that could back in that northern frontier the rise to power of a favorite, and being also essentially close neighboring Holland, Zeeland, etc. And the greatest problem in the path was Godfrey IV, Duke of Lower Lorraine, who was, however, assassinated while he was in a latrine, by the way. And this also favored greatly the effort of Robert and Dirk. Shortly afterwards, also William of Utrecht died. So all the major competitors here got out of the scene. Henry IV had enormous problems, as you know, with Italy, with the papal excommunication, the Gregorian reforms. So at that point, Germany was also engulfed in a series of civil strifes that deeply undermined also the capacity of the German monarchy to do anything about the situation in the northwestern frontier. The restoration of the Carinthian dynasty took also other important military measures. For example, Robert I and his stepson besieged the new Utrecht/Vlartingen castle as a very strategic place at the delta in the Zuiderzee. In today's Iselmonde, where the Hollandse Isel still exists, by the way, so it's a little isle, joined the Merwede. Now after 1 millennium doesn't look like that anymore really, but it's still the same place, right? And in this battle they also managed to capture the new bishop Conrad of Swabia, who was now forced to return the lands to Dirk V's control. And after this splendid success, the name of Holland appears in 1101 in a deed, also affirming properly the fact that this policy had come back on its feet. And this is a moment of great expansion in high medieval times, in fact, for many other European eras, but especially this new ones, also properly reclaimed from nature by a certain extent. Given that it's at this point that you start seeing the reclamation works against the danger of floods, often causing terrible damage. Seemingly the same aforementioned break during the migration era between the Frisi and the later Frisians might have been caused by such calamities. And in the 12th century, you're still seeing many new toponyms that properly tell you how the local county was properly involved in this works of canalization, etc. Slowly, Waterschappen were created with the so-called councils of the dikes, that is a kind of association to defend life and possessions against the powerful enemy of water, right? And so you have a people there that patiently and stubbornly, but still successfully managed to create also literally land out of water over the centuries with incredible hard work and coordination. This surely helped a great deal also the further development of the land. It was, again, at the time not yet any economic power like the one it would become in between the 17th and the 18th century, but still the construction of that land and the fundamentals were set those times under the countly direction. The existence in that semi-submerged country, that some areas properly are under the water level, and that's the point where all the dikes, etc., was so miserable that the chronicles of the time speak of emigration to the Ostland, that is to say, essentially West Germany and Brandenburg, so the land of the East from a Dutch geographical perspective. And in fact, even today in popular poetry, that of Ostland, which has become a fairy tale country, is praised as an earthly paradise, as a promised land. And you know that from the other side of the Germanic area, in fact, Germany itself was expanding gradually with the Ostsiedlung and the properly colonization, immigration movements of lots of these peoples, properly from the poorest fringes of the north, to cultivate, to work. I made videos about this, about the Brandenburg as well, not just the Margraviate, but there is something in medieval economy playlist connected with this kind of reclamation. And the power of Holland increased considerably in the following centuries. The Counts of Holland were able to conquer most of Zeeland, as we will see now. This diminished the power of the bishops of Utrecht, and the German monarchy was, in a sense, forced to recognize this fait accompli, and the feudalization of the country, generally speaking, brought Germany to, let's say, to act mostly on some dynamics that were more exquisitely political rather than more territorial in nature. In fact, at a point, as we will see, the Counts of Holland would be friends with the German royals. There was also a further attempt to expand in the north of Holland that, as we've seen, the same counts had kind of given up on because they preferred legitimately the west, where the largest infrastructure since kind of Roman times had always been there, but more centers, more trade. So that would be obvious, but there was essentially between the start of the 12th until the 13th century a fight, right? A good century and a half against the inhabitants of North Holland, who also still called themselves historically West Frisians, because again, Frisia was the entire arc, let's say, of Holland up to the Zeeland fundamentally. And as we will see, in fact, it's not until 1289 that the Count of Holland is able to subjugate the West Frisians, and still that were kind of a pain in the behind and kind of a threat. And even on that occasion, it was a natural disaster that allowed this Count takeover because of Saint Lucia's flood, Saint Lucia Vloed. It was a storm tide affecting, in fact, the Netherlands and north of Germany. This, between December the 13th, 14th, 2087, it seemingly killed something between 50 and 80,000 people. Right, it's one of the largest floods ever recorded at the time. So just even imagine how they could cope with it in medieval times. And the West Frisians were prostrated by this disaster, and that's how they were practically obliged, even just to seek the aid of the county. And so the county, as we were saying in the beginning of the video, would be officially known till 1795 as the County of Holland and West Friesland, interestingly enough. The Dutch took part in the Crusades. Count Floris III was a devoted friend of Frederick Barbarossa and died in 1190 in Antioch. William I of Holland was, distinguished himself greatly at the capture of Damietta in 1219. There is also a famous illumination that shows the participation, in fact, of the Frisians, also with their ships. By the way, this is interesting in terms of the naval culture, kind of naval engineering of the Dutch. With it's northern kind of Atlantic ships were different from the Mediterranean one, but still they had their own share there. This latter Count, William I, was the first to give city rights to municipalities in the county, specifically to Geertruidenberg in 1213 and Dordrecht in 1220. Count William II, who reigned between 1235 and 1256, was famously elected as King of the Romans in 1247. These are the last years. This is against Conrad IV of Hohenstauf, and this the time Frederick II was still alive, but effectively the Swabian grip and, generally speaking, the royal one on Germany was falling apart. There were three anti-kings, and William was one of them. And it shows by the great influence that Holland had. Of course, there wasn't much, that they could do. But in a moment again of disgregation of a state, these princes thought well to take over, as we were saying before, the same the same church at some point abandoned the Hohenstaufen, as I said also in that video about Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick. It was an early thing, a moment of crisis starting with the 13th century. And William the second was killed, by the way, famously enough, by the Frisians in 1256. So just to tell you what was the general temper of the locals, and always in this kind of same scenarios, like, you know, the heavy feudal knight bogged down and this Frisian commoners, you know, smashing the hell out of the guy with their weapons. In fact, the Frisians, as we were also remembering, would be partly protagonists of the infantry revival, let's say, of the early 14th century. William was succeeded by his son Floris V, ruling between 1256 and 1296. When his father was killed, he was 2 years old. Floris, however, proved to be a competent ruler. He brought great commercial advantages to his people. Among others, he established the depots of English wool in Dordrecht. So you see, from this kind of late medieval time, that properly the Dutch, as opposed to the Flemish, start rising. Think about cities like Antwerp and Arnhem, and the same Amsterdam. We will see starts emerging at this time, whereas before it was cities like Brugge and Ghent that had the lion's share. And of course, the Dutch-English connections are important as well. Floris V was the first ally of the English king, so much so that his son John married an English princess. He was a friend and protector of the people. In fact, locally was known as der Kerlengott, that is to say, the god of the plebs, which was actually a derogatory name given to him by the Dutch nobility that was also rebelling against the Count. And this is an important aspect of the story that we'll see now, because as the Netherlands were gradually emerging as significant commercial areas, let's say the local towns being ever more invested in maritime trade, etc., themselves gaining the initiative, it's obvious that, as it always happens, the monarch, in this case the Count, made leverage mostly on this kind of middle classes, right, on the towns that were an anti-feudal, anti-nobiliar force, and so the nobility wasn't happy at all of this, and attrition ensued. As we were saying before, Floris is the subduer of West Friesland, which was accomplished in 1289. He also won the Bishop of Utrecht, Amsterdam. At the time, it was just a simple fishing village, to which he gave, together with The Hague, the first impetus to a great development. When the English king helped the Count of Flanders against that of Hainaut, Floris' nephew, and again moved the Vol depot from Dordrecht to Brugge, Floris became an ally, however, of Philip IV of France. So you see again how the decentralized position of the Dutch allowed them to play either, with the favor of Germany or England or France, according to the case, and falling into the hands of rebel nobles who wanted to give given to his enemy Edward I of England. Floris was killed by them when the peasants attacked the castle of Muiden, where he had been temporarily taken. So, as you know, the French were particularly interested in Flanders. They launched essentially an invasion of the country that was their own by feudal right. The County of Flanders, at least the French part, and still the Dutch were involved in this game, essentially supporting the French instead in the process. As long as, at least as it had become more convenient as an option compared to the English. And the killing of Floris V triggered a popular revolt for the aforementioned reason, because the count had essentially protected the commoners against the nobility. And the latter got the worst of it, right? So much that their power was from that moment on limited in Holland. And this is again quite interesting, because it tells you how, in spite of the times, if you were talking about the end of the 13th century, it's the peak of Western civilization in medieval times. Like, you have properly the greatest economical and demographic boom. Well, especially in these areas, this was in relative terms greater, right? The richer lands in Europe were in the south, but countries like England, Germany, even this other more northern fringes had, in relative terms, growth more. And given that, as we've seen, the Netherlands had never had much of a social stratification, in general, was still some of the least developed areas in Europe. The local nobility was kind of more exposed and weaker in general, and so this revolt also kind of shows that kind of dynamic. Floris V, by the way, is still today considered sort of national hero of Holland, right? Albeit with his son John I ruling between 1296 and 1299, the House of Holland, this House of Holland ended. And in the following centuries, the so-called Hook and Cod Wars kept demonstrating the rivalry between the nobility and the bourgeois, if you prefer, especially, in fact, not just the commoners, but properly these middle classes of the Dutch towns. This was a long conflict going on between the mid-14th century to 1490, and that, again, in this Low Countries is more pronounced, generally speaking, because of their traditional autonomy. This kind of, say, that, as we've seen, the Netherlands, say specifically Holland, didn't have much of a strong urban, capacity, but still the Flanders had, and so they still were, as we've seen, improving and increasing, and so the cities were more autonomous here than in many other areas of Europe, and so there was always a struggle between the nobility and the people, and this was a multi-generational conflict, in fact, that involved lots of counts of Holland. In parts we will see now: William IV, Margaret, William V, William VI was at least Count of Holland, and later also the Burgundians, and in a sense the Upsburgs too, because this hostility again towards the foreign domination really never ends, right? The Dutch hated the Austrian Habsburgs, they hated the Spanish Habsburgs, and this is kind of normal. I would say that there was not much of a, it's not that the Netherlands were xenophobic more than other countries at the time. They just wanted their own autonomy, which they were habituated with, and even the 80 Years' War in perspective, at least historiography says, could be avoided, so don't think that these are, let's say, decisive factors, but still there was something to the local culture was kind of, thinking things a bit more independently already at that time. John I was succeeded by John II of the House of Avesnes in Hainaut, the House of Hainaut. John II was son of a sister of William II, so still a connection, but a descendant in female line. Which was a thing in some of these countries, by the way, differently from the Salian, the greater Salian habit. Now, the Flemings at this point were at war with the House of Avesnes. For this reason, they invaded Zeeland and Holland and took possession of them almost entirely. However, a natural son of Floris V, Witte van Hemstede, in a great battle at the Manpad in the dunes near Haarlem, won the Flemish and in a few days recaptured the country for John II, who however died in the same year, 1304. John was followed by William III, known as the Good, ruling between 1304 and 1337, which stabilized things. With the Treaty of 1323 finally obtained the uncontested possession of Zeeland that the Counts of Holland had been expanding on during the 13th century. Given, however, up his rights in Imperial Flanders in exchange. This is a moment of broader contraction of power in Europe, right? There is the crisis kicking in, so these kind of, silvering some parts of your possessions, that even though they're legally yours, etc., it's dictated by the more practical needs of compacting, like in this case, a greater territorial continuity in a kind of more rational sense. Also, there were problems of reorganization of the land. In 1315, he called an assembly of representatives of the nobility in the cities, which constituted essentially the first states of Holland altogether. And his daughter Margaret married the Emperor Louis the Bavarian. And when in 1345 Count William IV fell against the Frisians, again, this happened again in the Count being killed in battle against the rebels in Stavoren, that again is a proof of the power, the strength of infantry and the incredible brutality and effectiveness of this again primitive but successful communities. The emperor, the Wittelsbach, Louis the Bavarian, gave his lands as a fief to the empress, right? And this was the Wittelsbach phase, which was quite relevant because it connected, in a sense, Holland to a bigger game, to which, however, she was somewhat subordinated. At this time, Edward III of England, who had married a younger daughter, William III, also claimed, however, the same provinces for the Queen, and this, in fact, began a struggle that devastated the Netherlands for more than a century, and that is mirrored by the aforementioned Hook and Cod factions, the Hoekschen and Kabeljauwschen in the local language. The Hoekschen were the nobiliar side, roughly, right? There are some exceptions to this, of course, but they mostly mirror these positions. And the Kabeljauwschen, the Cod faction, the commoners, right? The bourgeoisie, at least. And soon at the head of the Kabeljauwschen was the son of Margaret, William V, that again, as a count, would mostly prefer to support locally the local towns against the nobility, then instead enjoyed more kind of foreign support. Instead it was expected in a more decentralized way, even in the same country. So because the external help wouldn't care to reinforce the autonomy of the towns, while the one who could rest on them locally would, right? This is the logic behind it. William V fought with alternate fortune, let's say, for many years, his own mother. And he, in 1354, obtained in the process Holland, Zeeland, but not Hainaut. Also, this was a success, of course, but he went mad a few years later. So these things happen as well. And his brother, Albert of Wittelsbach, ruling between 1358 and 1404, a very long reign for the time, ruled in his stead. And upon the death of his son, William VI, who had been married to a daughter of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip was followed as the last representative of the House of Bavaria by Jacqueline. She's an interesting figure because first of all, she had different marriages with different, in the sense, pretendants to same rule of Holland, and she tried essentially to maintain all along the autonomy of the land. However, there wasn't really much that this little state could do, especially since it had entered the orbit of the great state of Burgundy that had already essentially incorporated the entire lowlands. So the whole rule of Jacqueline was, at the end of the day, nothing more than a desperate attempt to maintain independence. And in 1433, the Countess lost the province as well. The Burgundians brought an important change in the Low Countries as a whole. They were interested mostly in incorporating this land really integrally, so they actually pursued more support of the towns that benefited greatly from having entered this broader Burgundian circuit. You know that the Burgundian state at the time was essentially the most beneficent court of Europe. It had enormous ambitions. All the greatest crusades of fighters at that point were led, like Europeans were led by the Dukes of Burgundy, were kind of the gold standard of chivalry and of prestige and wealth, and so on. The truth is that the state of Burgundy was somewhat heterogeneously and patchily put together. It collapsed too easily, as we've seen also recently in the video about Louis XI, that incidentally witnessed the collapse with Charles the Bold, etc. Holland's trade at this point developed rapidly, especially in the areas of shipping and transport. The Burgundians, the Valois Burgundy, defended Dutch trading interests. The fleets of Holland defeated even the fleets of the Hanseatic League several times. The Hanseatic League has enjoyed an enormous power, as you know, as a trade association, but even this one was not really much of a stable power. Fundamentally, it had risen because of the weakness of the surrounding monarchies. But when the German princes started compacting their own states, also the Scandinavian kingdoms became more cohesive. The Hanseatic League declined. In the Netherlands, that were still, of course, framed in the broader system, however, benefited from this dynamic. Amsterdam especially grew, and in the 15th century, it became the primary trading port in Europe for grain from the Baltic region. It was starting to become a thing. You know, the Russian grain fundamentally was shipped throughout the Baltic and the North Seas to be imported in places like Portugal, like Spain. Well, Amsterdam was the main medium of that, and also distributing grain to the major cities of Belgium, northern France, and England, that at the time also were impressively rising as important demic centers. So the trade was vital to the people of Holland, that still enjoyed, again, a very decentralized position after all, because the Burgundian state, at least until it was standing on its feet, was the domination. There was nobody else coming to bother them, especially in places like in the far north, like Holland. And so the country was fundamentally sheltered in the process. And it was just vital for Holland to be connected with England, with northern France, with Belgium, that however neighbors. So eventually this position would have been maintained historically. And the interesting fact about this is that towards, in fact, the late Middle Ages, the thresholds of the early modern age, there is an interesting trait dynamic, that is to say that really speaks of modernity. That is to say that Holland, at this point, literally owed its survival to this trade because it couldn't produce enough local grain to feed its own population. In other words, the population growth that also the region witnessed, importantly at this time, was sustained by imports, not local resources, because still the land was nothing particularly productive per se. It was just this dramatic commercially strategic position that gave Holland in the broader international scene of the various powers were rising and trade routes developing according to this massive advantage. Consider that land drainage had also caused the peat of the former wetlands to reduce to a level that was too low for drainage to be maintained, right? So as you understand, by this time, Holland was already a thriving region, right? Much of the swamp also had been cleared, although in 1421 there was yet another terrible flood which destroyed towns and villages and detached Dordrecht from the mainland, interestingly enough. The House of Burgundy had a great relevance also for another political, administrative, and consequently cultural and national reasons, because under them, the Low Countries really acquired for the first time historically a true kind of national awareness by a certain degree, at least a proto-national one, given the administratively homogenizing effort of the House of Burgundy, which wanted to control the various towns in an ever more efficient, rational way. And so this, even though, as we've just seen in this video, these lands didn't really have much of a previous glue that kept them together. Well, the Netherlands as a whole, and historically how it went. One became independent with the United Provinces. The other would be essentially Belgium that had been under France. But there is a true kind of national spirit in both these areas that, after all, are a bit like the consequence of that Lotharingia that nobody really thought saw it emerging as a national power. But if you consider the Benelux between France and Germany, well, that in a sense, that there is a survival of this early cut, then this continuous autonomy, and in part also what the Burgundian state brought to that in terms of a broader awareness of the development of parliaments, of having a dialogue with the entire land, because Burgundians didn't have much time to lose, and they were practically always needing money. And I made a video about the Burgundian military organization, where I also discussed the contribution that the Flemish, also the Dutch, in this sense, this divisional idea, provided for the army, mostly militias and guns too. There weren't nothing special. Again, there was nothing like a state developing. Burgundy was instead had developed the ordinances like France was doing. Was just trying to be a real state with a semi-permanent army, and all these other northern towns were just so autonomous that, in fact, had just thought about growing individually wealthy, not really creating something like the unity of a national state or anything, right? So that's also the reason why they had been taken over quite easily, telling the truth, without too much of an opposition. And again, they just counted on their autonomy. It's a bit like also how it would happen for many Hanseatic cities. Think about Bremen, or still today say, we are independent states, factually, within the same federation of Germany. In any case, as you know, the Netherlands were destined to, instead of very strongly compact and successful national history, to this very day. I mean, they're some of the richest countries in the world, and they're the most advanced, and so on. So the centralizing government of the House of Burgundy, however, did not please the nobility, right, who felt their privileges threatened. In a general sense, this is true also for the same towns. I mean, the towns were, as we've seen, conquered fundamentally, and they would have preferred just not to be under the Burgundians in the first place. There were other administrative changes. Philip the Good, for example, 1433-1467, established the Dutch court in 1428. This is part of the administrative measures that conferred this kind of Dutch unitary political awareness. They also introduced Roman law instead of the traditional Germanic one in the land, because the French were just using it and was much more advanced system. Eventually, the Netherlands would develop historically a very interesting hybrid in juridical science between Roman and German and, say, customary law. Then also a Supreme Court for all the Netherlands was established at Malines in the south in 1474, which was considered to be actually in full contrast to the privileges, because it was essentially advocating certain judicial functions that were, as you know, quite remunerative for the local courts. And this was just like a bigger authority saying, we now command, and so every place can cease to do their own little kind of mob. But the general welfare increased. Like, these were in fact positive administrative measures that helped developing further in a settled direction. As we were saying before, the fishermen of Holland and Zeeland became more and more great navigators. Culture in general was also flourishing, especially after the invention of typography, which is attributed by many, at least to Laurens Koster of Haarlem. Well, Erasmus of Rotterdam made his Dutch homeland known in the humanistic milieu of Europe, so much that we still have the Erasmus in Europe as this broader kind of educational initiative that I thoroughly despise in the practice of it, but of course in the broader principle of a truly humanistic Renaissance awareness of a single European culture and the superiority of it in the first place. So as you know, Philip the Good was followed by Charles the Bold, who ruled between 1467 and 1477. And we know how it ended. He was killed in battle against the Swiss, and this was the end, effectively, of the Duchy of Burgundy, because the only heir was his daughter Mary, who ruled, actually, over Burgundy, in the Burgundian state from 1477 to 1482. And she married with Maximilian of Upsburg at the time, who also thus was able to maintain what we call the Burgundian inheritance, that factually had nothing to do with Burgundy in a national sense, but it was effectively the lowlands, the Low Countries, while Burgundy was annexated by France, so because it was French. But the Dutch had enjoyed a privileged as autonomous status in France itself, because it was kind of a state within the state, again, a sort of copy of the court of Paris, and extremely powerful. But Louis XI decided to go out to war and to seize it successfully. The Upsburg Rule began in the Netherlands. The states of the various provinces, including the Dutch ones, took the chance of these upheavals, of course, to autonomize themselves further. Right? This always happens again. At the moment, collapse of the greater power. Thus, the court of Malines was abolished, and with the privileges, the almost absolute autonomy of the individual statelets returned. Again, as we were saying before, the state of Burgundy didn't really rest on a true central power. It was this massive asset of the Duchy of Burgundy within France, but all these other lands across, in fact, the same French and, in fact, the Holy Roman Imperial territory were pretty much, they were individually controlled, but they were all disarticulated from one another. They were just an heraldic forest of different communes and fiefs and etc. So there was still by that point not much that these people felt to have in common, if not defending their own autonomy. And that's also how national identities are, as a matter of fact, actually formed, because true national identities is politically based. It's hardly a matter of, I just bond with you because you look similar or you speak similar. It also has to do with that, of course. But you must want to be a power in order to be a nation, and that's something very different, right? In any case, this was something was nurtured in the Netherlands over time. Mary and Maximilian gave birth to Philip the Fair, born in 1402, and this brought there are many events connected with this. There is the Battle of Vlartingen. They often mention there is this attempt of the Upsburgs to reform the Netherlands by essentially trying to centralize, even as a sort of Swiss model, but the local estates do not want to pay for a professional army, so this relations remain pretty much strained, right? As we were saying before, it's not that the Dutch had felt anything in common with the Austrians at all, and tried actually to get rid of them as soon as they could. Just they hadn't won a state on their own. They didn't have, in the broader games of power and the various consolidating forces in Europe, the rise of modern states, like any place in that sense yet. It would take, again, the 80 years war for it. However, the populations of Flanders and Holland, still aided by their decentralized positions, rebel against the Habsburgs, which also resurrected the struggle between the Hooks and the Cods. And the leader of the Hooks, Francis of Brederode, occupied Sluis and even Rotterdam in 1488. However, in 1492 he was defeated, and the troubles ended for a while. 2 years later, Philip of Habsburg, having come of age, took power and refused to recognize all the privileges given after the death of Charles the Bold. So, de facto continuing the centralizing policy of his grandfather as a Burgundian ruler, and considered this, that Philip, his son Charles V, Charles V, of all the melange of national backgrounds he had, he essentially thought to be a Burgundian knight. That's what his ideal really was, right? He was, as you know, born and raised in the Netherlands. That at that time, I'm talking about, by the way, the Netherlands in this sense as the Low Countries altogether, right? Ghent and Brugge actually were more favored than even Holland, and that, in fact, because they were just still richer, more populated, more important, and that's in fact the ones that the Habsburgs will manage to maintain historically, as opposed to the United Provinces that were the ones that rebelled. So you see how times change, but individual problems in the area remain kind of the same. And still today we have the Netherlands and Belgium as two separated countries to remind us of that history. Naturally, Philip the Fair's marriage to Johan of Aragon had a decisive influence in the Dutch history, as we well know. The Austrian and Spanish Union Um, um, Philip also entered into commercial treaties with England. This was very advantageous for trading, cabotage, and for fishing. Philip also died young in 1506. So at this point, his father was still alive. Maximilian again became regent for the young Charles V, in fact, and he appointed his daughter Margaret of Austria as governors of the Netherlands. Until in 1515, Charles himself became Lord of the Netherlands and Count of Holland. Thus, Charles V's continuous wars greatly damaged the Dutch trade, which, however, didn't have many opportunities in a sense. And on the contrary, they have made their choice. I mean, they greatly benefited from the connection with Spain that at that point was swarming in the Americas, and was actually the most powerful economy in Europe, and thus the Dutch for a while kept benefiting from this. In fact, it was the Dutch who distributed the same Spanish American colonial merchandise throughout Europe. So the country had a role in the Upsburg Empire, also what would become the Spanish Empire after, with Philip II, with the subdivision of the empire of Charles V between his son and brother, and the separation of course, of various titles, and the Netherlands going to Spain. That much criticized choice. That, however, doesn't take in consideration the relevance really that these lands had for Charles V, and the fact, of course, that Spain was the most prestigious branch of the Habsburg possessions at that point. I mean, there's no comparison with Austria at that time. Spain was by far, dramatically more powerful. Essentially, it's comparable in status with France, in a sense, even more, considering also the broader hegemony was won in Italy and the colonial empire. France had just a minor part, but on land was the more powerful entity. So we never talk about that history, but it's obvious that if you know it, and also the 80 Years' War, we made multiple videos about the Dutch army in early modern times. You know how significant also the medieval history of the Netherlands really is to explain how they arrived to that point. And what is interesting is, of course, the fact that the Netherlands under the Habsburgs are, albeit enjoying their own traditional autonomies by some degree, are brought again for the last time under the Holy Roman Empire. And as I was saying before, the United Provinces and also their broader civilizational history, etc., is provocatively enough, the result of a secession from the same Holy Roman Empire. That again, from those times where the Merovingians were harassing the Frisians, etc., in a way, it's the same story. And so it's a history of trouble, and very often very powerful cultures, let's say, emerge from trouble, emerge from crisis, emerge from this constant threat of annihilation, significantly enough. That is best exemplified also in the later history where, the Netherlands had to fight for their own independence against the Spanish, but also avoid being wiped out by the French. And so we're talking about a small country that, however, created between the end of the 17th to beginning of the 18th century, actually the best army in history in terms of cost benefits, economically speaking. They were all mercenaries, basically. It was not. They didn't even want to go to war. So there is much to learn about that, and we will perhaps have to start a modern history series, because that would be quite instructive in this regard. In any case, for today, I stop it here. We will keep talking about Dutch history, both in medieval and in modern times. For today, I stop it here. However, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.